The morning Cecil Wallace rode away from the only life he had ever known, the sky above Dry Creek. Kansas was the color of a bruise, healing purple and gold and aching at the edges, as though the land itself understood what was being surrendered. He had not planned it. That was the honest truth of it, and Cecil Wallace was nothing if not an honest man. He had not packed his saddlebags with any intention, had not stood before the cracked mirror above the wash basin in the bunkhouse and rehearsed a farewell. He had simply seen her, Adelaide Wells, stepping up onto the running board of her wagon with one hand gripping the iron rail and the other pressed flat against the small of her back to steady herself. And something inside him had cracked open like dry earth after the first rain of spring. By the time the wagon train had rolled out of Dry Creek at first light on the 14th of April in 1872, Cecil was already 300 yards behind it, following at a distance wide enough to keep himself invisible in the dust. He told himself he was just riding out. He told himself that. He told himself he had reasons to go east anyway, errands perhaps. Some vague and formless business that a man of 26 surely had somewhere in the direction the wagon train was heading. But the truth settled over him as the miles piled up beneath his horse's hooves, and the truth was simple and enormous and terrifying. He could not watch that wagon disappear over the horizon and pretend that it did not take something irreplaceable with it. He had known Adelaide Wells for exactly 11 days before she left. 11 days was not long. He understood that. He had heard men talk about love the way old-timers talked about lightning. It either struck you or it did not, and there was no predicting which fence post it chose. He had always considered such talk to be romantic foolishness, the kind of thing that grew in the minds of men who read too many dime novels and did not spend enough time doing actual work. He was a working man. He had been a working man since he was 14 years old, when his father died of a fever and left him the choice between starving in Missouri or finding wages anywhere the West would give them. He had punched cattle across 3 territories. He had fixed fences in January cold that split the skin of your knuckles. He had ridden night herd through thunderstorms that turned the sky into something biblical. He was not a man who was supposed to feel his heart turn to something molten and unmanageable at the sight of a woman pressing her hand to the small of her back as she climbed onto a wagon. And yet, Adelaide Wells had arrived in Dry Creek 11 days ago on the eastbound stage, traveling alone with 2 trunks and a carpet bag, and an expression of calm self-possession that made every person she passed stand slightly straighter, as though her dignity was contagious. She was 23 years old, with dark brown hair that she wore pinned up severely in public, and which Cecil had only once, seen loose around her shoulders in the brief window between her stepping out of Mrs. Harker's boarding house in the evening, and realizing she was not alone on the porch. It had lasted perhaps 4 seconds, the loose hair, the soft expression before the public mask reassembled itself, and it had ruined him entirely. She was a schoolteacher by training, heading west to Oregon Territory to meet her cousin, who had written her a letter describing the new settlement of Millhaven as a place desperately in need of educated women. Adelaide had read that letter, Cecil later learned, approximately 6 times before deciding that a life spent educating other people's children in a place that truly needed her was preferable to a life spent educating other people's children in the comfortable mediocrity of her home in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where she had done everything she was supposed to do, and had arrived at 23 feeling as though the walls were incrementally narrowing around her. Cecil had learned all of this not through any great intimacy, but through the way that small towns work, through Mrs. Harker, who was constitutionally incapable of keeping information to herself, and through the long evenings at Webb's General Store, where people gathered and talked, and Adelaide would sometimes come in for thread or writing paper, and stay longer than necessary because the company was good and the West, she was discovering, had a way of making people talk honestly with strangers that the East had long since forgotten how to do. He had spoken to her directly on 5 occasions. He had counted them, which was itself a form of confession he was not yet willing to make aloud. The first time was when her carpet bag had slipped from her hands outside the livery stable and spilled its contents across the street, and Cecil had been the closest person, and had gathered up her things: a small Bible, a folded letter, a pair of reading spectacles in a leather case, a hairbrush with ivory handles, and handed them back to her with a care that surprised him. She had thanked him with the directness that he would come to recognize as simply the way she spoke, without excess, without performance. "Thank you very much," she had said, and looked at him squarely, and that had been enough to make him think about it for the rest of the afternoon. The second time was at Webb's, when he had reached past her for a tin of tobacco and apologized, and she had told him not to be sorry, that she took up no more space than she had to, and he was welcome to reach. He had almost dropped the tobacco. The third time was longer. It was an evening when the wagon train scout, a leathery man named Briggs who chewed tobacco constantly and smelled powerfully of horses, had been explaining the route west to the assembled travelers in the street outside the hotel, and Cecil had found himself standing near Adelaide because there was no particular reason not to. She had asked Briggs 3 questions that revealed she had been studying the route with considerable care. She mentioned the altitude changes through the mountains. She asked about the spring water availability at a particular campsite near the Platte River, and she asked about the reputation of the trail through one particular stretch of Nebraska that had given travelers trouble in dry years. Briggs had been visibly impressed, in the way that men of his generation were impressed when women knew something practical, with a kind of startled respect that was part admiration and part sheepishness for having expected otherwise. Cecil had not said a word during any of this. He had simply stood close enough to be part of the conversation's warmth, and Adelaide had glanced at him once briefly, when Briggs confirmed that her information about the Nebraska stretch was accurate, and something in her eyes had said, "I knew I was right about that." The fourth and fifth times were shorter, briefer, but Cecil had stored them all the same. And then the wagon train had departed on the morning of April 14th, and Cecil had stood at the edge of Dry Creek's Main Street with his coffee going cold in his hand, and watched the line of canvas-covered wagons begin to move, and had seen Adelaide seated on the bench of the third wagon from the front, a dark green shawl around her shoulders, her face turned forward toward the horizon. And something in him had simply refused to let her go without following, even if he could not have told anyone, including himself, what he intended to accomplish by it. He had gone back to the bunkhouse, saddled his horse, a big roan gelding named Amos, rolled his blanket and his spare shirt and his shaving kit into his saddlebags along with his wages from the last 2 months, which he had been paid the previous Friday and had not yet sent home to his mother in Joplin, and he had ridden east of town until he found a wide arc that brought him around to the wagon train's southern flank at a distance of perhaps a quarter mile, where he could follow without being seen but could keep the line of wagons in view. He had, at this point, no plan. He had a roan horse named Amos and his last 2 months' wages, and a heart that felt, for the first time in a very long time, like it was pointed in the right direction, even if the direction made no practical sense whatsoever. The wagon train was organized by a man named Ezra Holcomb, who was the wagon master, a capable, serious, sun-darkened man of 50 who ran a clean outfit and tolerated no unnecessary drama among his travelers. There were 14 wagons in all, carrying 22 adults and a collection of children Cecil had not counted, plus the livestock and the supplies. Briggs served as scout. A young man named Toby, perhaps 18, drove the remuda. There was a preacher and his wife, 2 farm families with quantities of children and furniture, a hardware merchant relocating his business, a young couple who seemed to be arguing about something in low, continuous murmurs, several single men heading west for reasons of their own, and Adelaide. Adelaide was traveling with the wagon of a family named Cartwright Martin and Edna Cartwright and their 2 children, a boy of 9 and a girl of 6, who had agreed to provide her with a place to ride and meals in exchange for her assistance with the children's lessons during the journey. It was a practical arrangement, as most arrangements in the West were, and Cecil had learned of it through the efficient intelligence network of Mrs. Harker before Adelaide had even departed. On the first evening after he began following, Cecil made camp at a careful distance. He picketed Amos on a good patch of grass, ate cold biscuits from his saddlebag, and watched the distant firelight of the wagon train's camp glow orange against the darkening Kansas plain. He could hear, very faintly and only when the wind was right, the sounds of it, the movement of livestock, someone playing a harmonica, the occasional voice carried loose and meaningless across the distance. He was aware, sitting there in the dark eating his cold biscuit, that what he was doing was not precisely rational. He was a grown man of 26 who had abandoned a paying job, a decent job, working stock for the Harmon Ranch, which had kept him in wages and board for the past 8 months, in order to follow a woman he had spoken to 5 times across the Kansas prairie without her knowledge. If any of his fellow hands could see him, he would never hear the end of it. If he could see himself from the outside, he was not entirely sure he would recognize the man doing this. But he kept thinking about the way she had looked at Briggs when her information proved correct. That small, contained brightness in her eyes, the way she had held her certainty quietly, without display, and only let it show in that one glance. He kept thinking about the reading spectacles in the leather case and the Bible and the letter, and the way she had taken back her scattered belongings from his hands without embarrassment, with a simple thank you that treated the whole thing as exactly what it was, a courtesy, returned. He kept thinking that he had been riding ranges for 12 years and had never in his life felt the particular quality of attention that Adelaide Wells generated in him, which was not simply desire, though it was that too, but something more fundamental, the sense that she was a person of genuine substance and that knowing her more deeply would not be a disappointment. He did not know this for certain. He had spoken to her 5 times. But the feeling was there, as solid as the ground under his bedroll, and he had learned over 12 years of working in hard country that some feelings were worth trusting. He fell asleep to the distant harmonica and woke the next morning before dawn to saddle Amos in the cold dark and maintain his distance as the wagon train began to move again. The second day of following was harder in a different way. The sky turned overcast by mid-morning, and the temperature dropped, and the wind had a particular quality that the Kansas prairie specialized in, not cold enough to be dramatic, just persistently uncomfortable, pressing against the side of your face and finding the gap between your collar and the back of your neck with mechanical precision. Cecil rode with his hat pulled low and his coat buttoned and thought about what he was doing with a new clarity that the discomfort seemed to encourage. He thought about the Harmon Ranch and what Crawford Harmon would say when he turned up without his best hand. He thought about the letter he had not yet sent to his mother in Joplin and the 2 months' wages in his saddlebag. He thought about the fact that his entire plan, insofar as it could be called a plan, consisted of following a wagon train at a distance until some moment arrived in which it became appropriate to stop following and start being somewhere with a purpose. He had exactly one viable option as far as he could tell. He had to ride into the wagon train openly, introduce himself to Ezra Holcomb, and find some reason to attach himself to the outfit for the journey west. His ranching skills were real. He could handle livestock, could ride scout, could drive a team, could shoe a horse, could do any number of things that a wagon train might find useful. It was possible that Holcomb would take him on. The question was whether Adelaide would recognize him from Dry Creek, and what she would think if she did. He spent considerable time on this question as the wagon train's progress continued 200 yards ahead of him through the gray afternoon. He could not, he decided, begin this correctly by sneaking. If she saw through any attempt to pretend he was a stranger, and he suspected she would, because she was clearly a woman of considerable perception, then he would have started everything with a dishonesty, which was the worst possible foundation. But the alternative, riding in openly and saying something like, "I left my job because I could not watch you leave," was not a possibility he could produce without considerable internal preparation that he had not yet achieved. He needed, he realized, a middle ground, a practical reason that was also true. The middle ground arrived on the evening of the second day in a form he had not anticipated. The wagon train had made camp in a shallow draw near a creek, and Cecil had picketed Amos at his usual remove and was heating water for coffee over a small fire when he heard it, the distinctive, panicked lowing of cattle in distress, coming from the direction of the camp. He was up and mounted before the water had begun to steam. The remuda had spooked a snake in the grass, Toby would explain later, long and thick and suddenly visible, and approximately a third of the horses had broken through the picket line and were running south across the darkening plain directly toward Cecil's position. He counted perhaps 8 horses in the dim evening light, running hard and scattered, and he did not think about it. He simply put his heels to Amos and went after them. It took the better part of an hour, working in the gathering dark, to round up 7 of the 8. The 8th, a gray mare, had veered east and put considerable distance between herself and everything else, and Cecil had chased her hard for 20 minutes before she slowed enough to be approached, and he had walked her back at a careful pace, talking quietly, the way he had learned to talk to frightened horses, steady and low, and without urgency, letting the voice itself be the calm thing. When he came back into the circle of the camp's firelight, leading the gray mare and the 7 others strung behind him on a rope, he found Ezra Holcomb and Briggs and young Toby, and most of the adult men of the wagon train standing at the edge of the light, with expressions that mixed relief with confusion. He also found, because the world is not subtle about these things, Adelaide Wells standing slightly apart from the group, her dark green shawl pulled tight, watching him come in out of the dark with an expression he could not read at this distance. "That's my gray," Toby said, sounding weak with relief. "She went east," Cecil said, and swung down from Amos. He handed the lead rope to Toby and turned to find Ezra Holcomb directly in front of him. Holcomb was a man who assessed things quickly and accurately. You did not survive 20 years as a wagon master without developing an efficient instinct for character, and he looked at Cecil for a moment with the focused attention of a man doing rapid arithmetic. "You've been following us," Holcomb said. It was not a question. There it was. Cecil had not expected it quite this soon, but he found, now that it had arrived, that the relief of no longer maintaining the distance was already beginning to settle over him. "Yes, sir," Cecil said. "Since Dry Creek." "Yes, sir." Holcomb was quiet for a moment. Around them the camp had the peculiar quality of an audience attempting to appear otherwise occupied. The preacher's wife had found something urgent to stir over her fire. 2 of the farm men were suddenly very interested in recoiling rope. Cecil did not look toward Adelaide. He kept his eyes on Holcomb, which seemed like the correct choice. "What's your name?" Holcomb said. "Cecil Wallace. I was riding for the Harmon Ranch outside Dry Creek." "Was," Holcomb said. "I left on the 14th. Holcomb looked at him for another moment, and then something shifted in the older man's expression, not quite a smile, but a kind of recognition. "And what did you intend to do when you caught up?" "Find a way to be useful," Cecil said. "I can ride, drive a team, handle stock. I'm a decent hand with a rifle if it's necessary and a decent hand with a hammer if it's necessary, and I don't cause trouble." "You just chased down 8 spooked horses in near dark," Briggs said, from somewhere to the left. "Yes, sir." Holcomb was quiet again. Cecil had the sense of a decision being made with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who made important decisions regularly and did not rush them out of false urgency. "There's no wage," Holcomb said finally. "I run a tight outfit and what funds I have are spoken for, but there's meals and a place to sleep." "That's fair," Cecil said. "You pull your weight, no exceptions. You follow my orders, no argument. You cause any trouble, any kind of trouble with any person in this outfit, you're out." "Understood." Holcomb nodded once, the way men of his kind nodded, with finality and without ceremony. "Put your horse with the remuda. Toby will show you the picket arrangement. We move at first light." Cecil led Amos toward the remuda area, and it was only then, as the crowd around the firelight dispersed back to their various tasks, that he allowed himself to look. Adelaide was still standing where she had been, slightly apart, watching him. Their eyes met across the 20 feet of firelit ground between them, and Cecil felt the distance between them as a physical thing, as specific as weather. She held his gaze for a moment, the way she held things, quietly, without urgency, and then she turned and walked back toward the Cartwright wagon, and her shawl rippled once in the evening wind, and that was that. He had not been invisible. He had not thought she would have been unaware of him. But she had said nothing, and her expression had given him nothing clear to hold on to, and he spent his first night properly inside the wagon train's camp, lying on his bedroll with Amos picketed nearby, and the sounds of the camp around him, and the considerable uncertainty of his situation arranged over him like a second blanket. The third day was when everything changed. Cecil rose before dawn, as was his habit, watered Amos, and reported to Briggs, who put him to work helping the Cartwright family and 2 others reload their wagons after the morning camp was broken. He worked steadily and without complaint, which was also his habit, and by the time the train was moving, he had already been useful enough in small, concrete ways that he felt the outline of his place in the outfit beginning to solidify around him. He drove the Cartwright wagon for 2 hours in the morning, while Martin Cartwright walked alongside dealing with a loose wheel hub. And during those 2 hours the Cartwright children, Thomas, 9, and little Ruth, 6, sat on the bench beside him and subjected him to the kind of intensive questioning that children deploy on new adults in their vicinity, apparently operating on the theory that adults have interesting secrets waiting to be extracted by direct inquiry. "What's your horse's name?" Thomas asked. "Amos, that's a Bible name." "It is. My pa has a horse named General, but he's not in the Bible. Do you have any children?" "No." "Are you married?" Cecil glanced at the boy. "No." "Miss Adelaide isn't married either," Ruth offered, with the serene conversational randomness of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned that this kind of observation required scaffolding. Thomas elbowed his sister. Ruth elbowed back. Cecil kept his eyes on the team and did not say anything, and felt the warmth climb the back of his neck. Adelaide was walking alongside the wagon for much of that morning. It was her habit, he was learning, to walk rather than ride when the terrain was manageable, partly for the exercise, and partly because she found it easier to think while moving. She carried a small leather-bound notebook and wrote in it while she walked, which struck Cecil as something requiring a considerable degree of physical coordination. He watched her from the corner of his eye whenever he thought he could do so without being obvious, which was not as often as he would have liked and probably more often than was wise. Shortly before midday, she walked up to the side of the wagon. "Good morning," she said, and it was directed at him, clearly and without ambiguity. "Good morning," Cecil said. "I recognized you from Dry Creek," she said, "when Holcomb brought you into camp last night. I thought you might have." She kept pace with the wagon easily, her notebook tucked under her arm. "You were following us for 2 days before that." He found he had no good way to improve on the truth. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, and he had the sense of a person not deciding whether to be upset. She seemed too measured for sudden upset, but deciding which of several available observations to make. "You had a job in Dry Creek," she said, "with the Harmon Ranch, and you left it." "I did." She glanced up at him on the bench, and he could see her working through something, the same methodical way she had assessed the information from Briggs about the trail, not hostile, not warmed, simply serious and attending fully. "I don't know quite what to make of that," she said at last. "That's fair," Cecil said. "I'm not entirely sure I do either." She seemed to weigh this answer against some internal standard, and something in the set of her mouth changed slightly, not quite a smile, but the possibility of one. "Well," she said, "you seem to be useful to Holcomb at any rate. I hope so." She adjusted the notebook under her arm and looked forward at the horizon, which was wide and blue and complicated at the edges with the first distant suggestion of hills. "Oregon is a long way," she said. "It is. I imagine there will be plenty of work for capable hands." She said it without particular inflection, and then she stepped back from the wagon and let it move ahead of her, returning to her walking pace and her notebook. And Cecil sat on the bench with the reins in his hands and the Kansas spring moving around him, and the feeling that something had been said that was worth examining carefully at length. Thomas, who had been listening with the unabashed attention of 9 years old, looked up at Cecil with bright, speculative eyes. Cecil pointed ahead at the horizon. "Watch the road," he told the boy. Thomas faced forward with the expression of someone receiving extremely interesting information. The wagon train made good progress through the rest of April. The weather held mostly fair, with only one significant rain that turned the trail to mud and cost them a day and a half in the patience of everyone involved, particularly the hardware merchant, whose wagon was the heaviest and sank axle-deep in a crossing that the lighter wagons had managed with nothing worse than swearing. Cecil spent 4 hours in knee-deep mud helping lever that wagon free with a collection of other men, and a rope system that Holcomb organized with the calm authority of someone who had done this before. When the wagon finally came free with a sound like the earth releasing something it had been holding against its will, a small cheer went up from the assembled travelers, and Cecil was aware, looking up through the relief of it, that Adelaide was standing on the bank with her skirt hiked above the mud and a look of profound practical satisfaction on her face. She had been making notes. He caught a glimpse of the open notebook in her hand, making notes about the crossing. He would have asked what she wrote, but the moment passed, and he was covered in mud and not in a state to begin any conversation he wanted to go well. That evening, though, she found him at the fire where he was cleaning up with a cloth and a bucket of creek water, and she stood with her coffee cup warming her hands and asked him what he had thought of the crossing approach, the angle of entry specifically, and whether the alternative line that Briggs had initially suggested would have been better. He looked at her. He considered the question. Then he told her what he had actually thought, that Briggs's first instinct had been to go straight, which would have been a disaster with a heavy wagon, and that Holcomb's decision to angle the crossing and use the current's pressure to assist the passage, rather than fight it, had been the right call, though it had still required more effort than it should have because the first 2 wagons went too quickly and packed the worst mud down before the heavy wagon reached it. She listened to all of this with the notebook open in her hand and wrote something down without taking her eyes off him while he talked. "What are you writing?" he asked when he had finished. "Trail notes," she said. "For anyone who makes this crossing in the future. The angle Holcomb used, the specific positioning of the rope anchor, things that would be useful to know." He stared at her. "Why?" he managed. She looked at him as though the answer was self-evident, which perhaps to her it was. "Because someone should, and because I want to be a teacher in Millhaven. These are the kinds of practical things that should be taught: how to read terrain, how to manage a crossing, how to make decisions in conditions that change. The books I was trained on don't cover most of what actually matters out here." Cecil looked down at the cloth in his hands and then back up at her. He was aware of the firelight doing things to her face that he was trying not to think too specifically about, because he was already on uncertain enough ground. "You are going to be an extraordinary teacher," he said. It came out more directly than he had planned. It sat in the air between them with all of its weight visible. She was quiet for just a moment, and then she said, quietly, "Thank you, Cecil." And it was the first time she had used his name, and he felt it in approximately the same place he imagined lightning would feel if it had the decency to ask before it struck. She took her coffee and her notebook back toward the Cartwright wagon. Cecil watched the fire for a while and then went to check on Amos, because checking on Amos was something he could do with his hands that gave his mind the space it needed. May came in warm and generous. The wagon train crossed into Nebraska territory with good weather and good water, and a stretch of trail that Briggs had worried about proving, against his expectations, passable and even pleasant in the specific way that big, empty country is pleasant when you have learned to read it as landscape rather than obstacle. Cecil had been part of the outfit for 2.5 weeks now, and he had found his place in it with the efficiency of a man accustomed to making himself fit situations. He rode scout with Briggs on alternating mornings, handled the heavy work of repairs and loading, kept the remuda in order with Toby, and in the evenings was generally where the work was, which was everywhere. He and Adelaide had begun talking the way you begin talking when two people are intelligent and in close proximity over an extended period, and have discovered that the other person is worth the effort gradually, and then with increasing frequency, and then with a naturalness that surprised him every time he noticed it. She walked beside his horse in the mornings when she was not walking and writing. He sat near her fire in the evenings when there was space. They talked about the landscape and the trail and the families in the wagon train and the news that travelers coming the opposite direction occasionally brought. And they talked about books, and they talked about practical things, the best ways to waterproof canvas, the caloric density of various trail foods, the maintenance of wagon axles, and they talked about their lives before Dry Creek, though carefully at first, with the selectivity of people who have learned that not every piece of personal history is safe currency with a near stranger. He told her about his father and Joplin and the cattle work. She told him about Harrisburg and the school and the letter from her cousin, which she described as arriving at precisely the right moment, like a door opening in a wall she had been pressing against for several years. He told her about Amos and how he had purchased him off a man in Abilene who was clearly drunk and underselling what was actually a fine horse, and she had laughed, not the polite, contained laugh of public social interaction, but the genuine one, short and bright, which he filed carefully away as one of the better sounds he had heard in recent memory. There were evenings when the whole camp gathered, which was a frontier tradition that the isolation of wagon travel encouraged. Someone played music, which in this outfit meant Briggs on harmonica, and a farm woman named Geraldine on a small fiddle she had brought wrapped in quilting fabric. And there was dancing of the informal kind that does not require formal arrangements, just enough cleared space and the right kind of music. Cecil danced with Adelaide on one such evening in early May, a simple country reel that required more footwork than grace, and he was aware for the entire length of it that he was holding her hand, and that this was one of the more remarkable things he had experienced in 26 years of living. She was a competent dancer. Of course she was. She was competent at everything she attempted, not in the showy, aggressive way of someone proving a point, but in the quiet, organic way of a person who gives her full attention to whatever she is doing. He had watched her teach Thomas and Ruth their lessons every morning with the same quality of focused intelligence she brought to reading terrain or writing trail notes, and the children were plainly flourishing under it. Thomas had started asking questions about the stars, and Ruth had started making up small stories and asking Adelaide to write them down, which Adelaide did without condescension, treating Ruth's narratives as the genuine creative productions they were. He loved that about her. He had begun assembling a quiet private inventory of the things he loved about her, not to do anything with it, but simply because the accumulation of them felt necessary, like counting something valuable. In the second week of May, they were moving through a stretch of Nebraska where the land opened into something enormous, not the modest openness of Kansas, but a scale that made the wagons seem like toys, and the people inside them seem very small and very human in the way that genuine immensity tends to reveal. The sky was so large it seemed to press down at the edges. The grass moved in long waves that looked like water. Adelaide stood at the back of the moving Cartwright wagon one afternoon and looked out at it with an expression Cecil happened to see from horseback. He was riding on the train's southern flank, checking the terrain for the afternoon crossing, and her expression was one he had not seen on her before. Not her competent, attending face, not her careful listening face, not her genuine laugh face. Something rawer. Something that looked like a person being struck by the magnitude of what they had undertaken and feeling it all the way down. He rode up alongside the wagon. She looked at him. She did not rearrange her face, which he appreciated. "It is a very large country," she said. "It is." "I knew it was large, obviously. I have maps, but maps do not," she paused. "They do not convey the particular quality of this." "No," he agreed, "they don't." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the grass moving like water. "Do you ever feel overwhelmed by it?" It was a genuinely personal question, and she was asking it with the directness that was simply how she spoke, and he gave it the honesty it deserved. "When I was younger, yes. It made me feel insignificant. Now it mostly makes me feel honest." She looked at him. "Honest. Hard to pretend to be bigger than you are when the country is telling you every day exactly what size you are." She considered this. "That is either very wise or very bleak." "Maybe both," he said. She almost smiled. "Yes, maybe both." The Platte River crossing was their most significant logistical challenge of the journey, and it absorbed everyone's full energy and attention for 3 days. The river was running high for the season due to snowmelt from the distant mountains, and Holcomb made the decision to wait 1 day before attempting the crossing, watching the water level and the current speed with the focused patience of a man making an important calculation. Cecil spent that waiting day scouting the crossing points with Briggs, riding upstream and downstream to find the best possible line, and came back with specific recommendations that Holcomb incorporated into the crossing plan. On the crossing day itself, Cecil worked from before dawn until after dusk, helping guide wagons through the current, swimming Amos across 3 times to carry ropes, and at one point, when the hardware merchant's wagon hit a submerged rock and began to tip, jumping into the river with a rope to shore up the downstream wheel while other men pulled from the bank. The water was cold enough to take the breath away, with the specific energetic cold of mountain-fed rivers that have not yet had time to be warmed by the plains. He came out of it dripping and shaking slightly with cold and found Adelaide holding his spare coat from his saddlebag. She had taken it from Amos without being asked, because she had anticipated that he would need it, and that small act of practical foresight undid him more thoroughly than anything that had come before. He put the coat on and could not find anything to say. She straightened the collar with one brief, matter-of-fact gesture, the way a person straightens a collar for someone they care about without making a production of it. And then she went back to the business of helping Edna Cartwright with the children who were cold and tired and complaining. And Cecil stood on the bank of the Platte River in his dripping clothes inside his dry coat, and experienced the extremely clear understanding that he was in love with Adelaide Wells in a way that was going to be permanent. He had known it before, in the way that you know things that are true but not yet fully processed. Now it was processed. It was sitting in him, solid and real and not going anywhere, like the good hardwood of a well-built thing. The crossing completed, they camped on the far bank and built large fires, and everyone dried out and ate, and there was that particular quality of evening warmth that follows a difficult day accomplished together. Cecil sat near Adelaide at the fire, and they talked for a long time, longer than usual, with the ease that shared difficulty creates. And at some point, he told her about his mother in Joplin, and the letter he had not sent because he had left before mailing it. Adelaide asked what his mother was like. He told her. Small, very certain about everything, deeply religious in a way that was genuine rather than performative. A woman who had raised him alone after his father died, and had done it with such consistent competence that it had not occurred to him, until he was much older, to understand how remarkable it was. Adelaide listened to this with the quality of attention he had come to rely on. And then she said that she had been raised primarily by her mother's sister after her parents died of typhoid when she was 8, and that her aunt was a perfectly decent woman who had done everything she was supposed to do and felt nothing about any of it, which was worse in certain ways than being raised by someone who felt too much. He understood this completely and said so, and she looked at him with the expression that appeared when something he said landed exactly where she had placed it. "You are very easy to talk to," she said. "That was not something I expected." "What did you expect?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, which she always did. "I expected a cowboy who had followed me for mysterious reasons to be either threatening or foolish. You are neither. Good. You are also not forthcoming about your reasons," she said. He looked at the fire, he looked at her. "No, I think I know what they are," she said quietly. "I'm not certain I have been paying no attention." "What do you think they are?" She looked down at her coffee. The firelight moved in it. "I think you are a man who felt something he did not know how to address directly, and so you addressed it by being useful." The accuracy of this was complete. He sat with it for a moment. "That's about right," he said. "It is a very indirect way of going about things," she said. "I know. Though I appreciate the usefulness," she added, and now the not-quite smile was fully present, warm and precise. "The coat was important. You got the coat." "I got your coat," she agreed, "which should perhaps tell you something." He looked at her. She was looking at the fire, but the smile was there, not hidden, not performed, just real and quiet and his to see. "Adelaide," he said. She looked up. "I left the Harmon Ranch because I could not watch you leave and do nothing about it," he said. "I didn't have a plan. I still don't have a plan. I just knew that following seemed like the only thing that made sense." She held his gaze for a long moment. The fire moved between them. Somewhere in the camp, Briggs played a slow, low note on the harmonica that sounded like something trying to put itself into words. "That is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in several years," she said at last. "Possibly longer. I mean every word of it." "I know you do," she said. "That's why it's the most honest thing I've heard." She did not say anything more that night about what she felt, and he did not push. He had learned, watching her, that she did not move quickly in the territory of feelings, not because she did not feel things, but because she felt them carefully and would not speak until she was sure of what she had. He could wait. Amos could keep pace, and the Oregon Territory was still a long way off, and the whole journey lay ahead of them like a clean page. They moved through Wyoming Territory as June deepened, and the landscape changed again, the gentle grass of the plains giving way to something more dramatic, the land asserting itself with rocky outcroppings and high desert sage, and the kind of geological ambition that makes a person feel the deep time of the earth, rather than just the human time of wagon ruts and campfire rings. The mountains were visible now on the horizon, still distant but undeniable, a permanent fact of the western sky. Cecil had established himself so thoroughly in the outfit by now that there was no longer anything remarkable about his presence. He rode scout with Briggs every other morning as naturally as though this had always been the arrangement. He helped Martin Cartwright repair a cracked wheel spoke with the patience and skill of someone who had done this kind of work many times. He sat with the preacher, a man named Elwood Marsh, on an evening when Marsh was wrestling with something private and difficult, and had the kind of conversation that moves slowly in the dark and does not solve anything, but makes the unsolvable slightly more bearable by virtue of company. He and Adelaide walked together now without either of them marking it as anything requiring explanation. It had become the natural shape of their days, walking in the mornings, talking in the evenings, doing the work that needed to be done, and doing it often near each other. The other members of the wagon train had made the kind of collective quiet observation that small traveling communities make, and had arrived at the consensus that seemed correct to them, which was that these two were heading somewhere together, and it was polite to give them the space to arrive. Edna Cartwright, who was a warm-hearted, shrewd woman who had clearly seen a great deal of life already and expected to see more, told Adelaide one afternoon while they were repairing the cover of the Cartwright wagon, Adelaide sewing on one side, Edna on the other, that she thought Cecil Wallace was a good man. Adelaide, who had not heard herself thinking anything to the contrary, nonetheless received this information with the particular blankness of a person who has been offered a gift they are not sure they should take in front of witnesses. "He is very capable," Adelaide said. "He is that," Edna agreed. "He's also been looking at you the way my Martin looked at me before he worked up the nerve to say anything, for about 4 months straight just looking." Adelaide made a small sound that was not quite a response. "I thought you should know," Edna said. "Some women like to be informed of such things. Some prefer to figure it out themselves. I thought you looked like the kind who prefers information." "I do generally prefer information," Adelaide said. "Well then." She sewed in silence for a moment. "He told me," Adelaide said then carefully, "some of it, that night after the Platte crossing." "I know. Half the camp could hear you talking," Edna said placidly. "Not the words, just the sound of two people being honest. It has a particular quality." Adelaide looked at the seam she was working. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I think I am frightened." "Of what specifically?" she considered. "Of arriving in Millhaven as a woman who made decisions based on a man she had known for a few weeks on a wagon trail." Edna took 3 careful stitches. "And if you arrived in Millhaven as a woman who had met a remarkable person and acknowledged it honestly, would that be so different?" "It would feel different." "Yes," Edna said. "I expect it would." That evening, after supper, Adelaide found Cecil at the edge of the camp, where he had taken a habit of sitting in the last light to watch the sunset work through the mountains. The Wyoming sky at sunset was one of the more preposterous natural events Cecil had witnessed, and he had witnessed a fair number. It turned colors that seemed unlikely, deep rose and orange, and a particular shade of gold that made everything it touched look as though it were being briefly shown its best possible version of itself. She sat down beside him on the flat rock he had claimed. He did not say anything immediately. He had learned to let silences be themselves rather than fill them. "I wrote to my cousin last week," she said, "from the last trading post. How is the settlement coming?" "Well, apparently. He says there are nearly 200 families now. The school is a converted barn, but it has a proper chalkboard." She paused. "He also has a spare room he is keeping for me, but he asks whether I am coming alone or whether the situation has changed." Cecil looked at the mountains. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I would write again when I knew." He was quiet for a moment. The sunset moved through its phases without waiting for anyone. "What would you need to know?" he asked. She turned to look at him, and in the western light she looked like something he would not have been able to describe to anyone, real and complicated and soft in the places where she was usually careful, and careful in the places where she was usually private. "I need to know whether you have thought this through," she said. "Not the following. I know why you followed. I need to know whether you have thought about what comes after." "I have thought about very little else." "And?" He turned to face her properly. The last light was in her eyes, and he could see in them the thing she had been holding carefully for the past weeks, not absence of feeling but the unwillingness to offer it before she was sure it was safe to do so. "I don't know what your cousin's spare room looks like," he said, "and I don't know what Millhaven is going to need in terms of work, but I know that wherever you're going, I want to be going in the same direction, not behind you, beside you." She breathed in slowly and then out. "That is a considerable thing to want," she said. "I know it is. We have known each other less than 3 months. 2 months and some weeks," he said. "Since Dry Creek, if you count the 11 days before." She almost smiled at the fact that he had been counting. "You counted." "I counted." She looked out at the mountains. The light was changing, moving from gold toward rose, and the mountains took it in without comment. "I am not a simple woman," she said. "I have opinions about a great many things, and they are well-formed opinions, and I will not easily change them. I know. I have plans that I am not willing to set aside. I am going to Millhaven because the school is real and the need is real, and I am committed to it. I know that too. And you would," she stopped, started again. "You would consider that. Coming to Millhaven with no particular standing, No guaranteed work, simply to be there. I would go anywhere reasonable if it put me where you were, he said. Millhaven seems very reasonable. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the sunset moved fully into its final phase, the colors deepening and the first stars beginning to consider appearing. Then I will tell my cousin that the situation has changed, she said at last, and ask him to be sure the house has 2 spare rooms. It was not a declaration of love in the dramatic, sweeping way of novels. But it was Adelaide, offering him what she had in the precise amount she was sure of it, and he understood that this was more valuable than any declaration performed at a level of certainty she had not yet fully reached. He understood that this was her saying, "I am including you. Come into what I am building." 2 spare rooms, he said. For propriety, she said primly. And then the genuine laugh appeared, the short, bright one he had stored away weeks ago, and he laughed too. And the mountains went from rose to purple to the quiet blue of oncoming night, and the stars came out above Wyoming territory in their hundreds and then their thousands, and neither of them moved for a long time. The rest of June and most of July were the physical heart of the journey, the mountain passages that Holcomb had been preparing them for, the long climbs that tested the teams and the wagon beds and the patience of everyone involved. The passes through the mountains of the Wyoming and Idaho territories were demanding work, requiring the whole train to work as a coordinated unit in ways that the easier plains travel had not. Cecil was everywhere that he was needed, which was most places, and he worked with the physical totality of a man who has been strong all his adult life and knows how to deploy strength efficiently without burning it. Adelaide helped in the ways she could and deferred in the ways she should, and Cecil had been watching her long enough to see the specific intelligence with which she had made peace with the limits of her physical strength. She could not push a wagon up a steep grade the way a man could, but she could manage 3 children whose parents were occupied with the wagon, could make decisions about load distribution when asked, could read the condition of a struggling animal with accuracy, because she had been paying close attention to the animals for months. She had made herself knowledgeable about everything within reach, which was simply who she was. In the evenings in the mountains, the temperature dropped dramatically and the sky was remarkable. The altitude cleared it of everything soft, and the stars were hard and brilliant, and numerous beyond reason. And the campfires were smaller in the mountain camps for safety, but felt warmer for the cold around them. Cecil and Adelaide sat together every evening now without any particular formality about it, and the other members of the train sat near them, and they were all part of the larger warmth of the shared camp. And it was in this period that Cecil began to understand what the word home had always been attempting to communicate to him. Not a place, necessarily, but a collection of people and habitual comfort, the particular ease of being somewhere expected and welcome. One evening in the mountains, when the wind was high and the fire small and the camp had drawn in tight together for warmth, he told her about his mother's house in Joplin, the specific smell of it, cornbread and something floral from the garden his mother kept, and the way the afternoon light came through the kitchen window at a particular angle in summer that he had thought about many times in the years since he left. In the way that you think about the precise sensory qualities of a place you love when you are far from it. She listened, and then she told him about the school in Harrisburg, the rows of desks and the smell of chalk and the window she sat nearest as a student, which overlooked an elm tree that went through its seasons visibly from where she sat, and how she had spent considerable time looking at that elm tree when the lessons bored her, which she admitted was more often than she had let on at the time. "What were you thinking about?" he asked, "when you were looking at the elm?" She was quiet for a moment with the fire between them and the mountain wind above. "Places that were farther than Harrisburg," she said. "People I had not met yet." He looked at her. She looked at the fire. "I should write that letter to my cousin," she said, with the slight change of subject that was not quite deflection, because her cheeks were warmer than the firelight accounted for, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it. He wrote his own letter to his mother in Joplin on the same night, a long letter by his standards, telling her about leaving the Harmon Ranch and joining the Wagon train and what he found there. He did not say everything plainly. He was not yet a person who could write everything plainly. But he described Adelaide in terms that he suspected left very little ambiguous to a woman who had known him his whole life. And he sealed the letter and handed it to Holcomb to post at the next trading station, and felt the specific relief of having told the truth to someone who deserved to hear it. They descended from the mountains in early August, and the landscape shifted again. The high desert of what would become Idaho Territory, a vast and arid beauty that asked different things of travelers than the grass or the mountains had. Water management became Holcomb's primary concern, and Cecil rode ahead with Briggs on longer scouts to confirm the water sources at planned camps. On one such scout, 3 days into the Idaho stretch, they encountered a small group of Shoshone men traveling east, 4 of them, moving quickly, and Briggs knew enough of the Shoshone language to establish in brief, careful conversation that they were returning from trade with a settlement to the north. There was the particular careful courtesy of 2 groups of armed men on a wide road establishing that neither had hostile intentions, and then they passed and continued in their separate directions. And Cecil thought about the landscape. They were crossing land that had been traveled and known and used by people for thousands of years before the wagon ruts arrived, which was a thought that the West had a way of making unavoidable if you were paying attention. He mentioned this to Adelaide that evening, and she said that she had been thinking about it too, that the trail notes she was keeping were notes on a landscape that already had its notes written in it by people whose knowledge of it was infinitely older and more complete, and that she intended to teach that to the children in Millhaven. Not just the fact of the geography, but the full weight of the human history carried in it. He looked at her across the fire, and he thought, "There is not a single thing I have said that she has not improved upon by thinking about it more deeply." And he felt the love in him settle into something that had no anxiety in it at all, just the clean, warm certainty of something that has found its correct place. August moved forward. The desert gave way to the greener country of the Oregon Territory, which arrived gradually and then suddenly, the landscape tipping over a geographical threshold into something cooler and more lush, the air changing, the vegetation changing, the sky seeming to lower itself gently like a hand over the whole enormous distance they had crossed. Adelaide, the morning they crossed into Oregon, stood at the front of the Cartwright wagon on the running board, holding the iron rail with one hand the same way she had stood that first morning in Dry Creek, the morning that had set everything in motion, and looked out at the country ahead with an expression that Cecil watched from horseback and did not interrupt. She deserved this moment in its full privacy. He had seen her walk every hard mile of this. He had watched her teach through the exhaustion of long-traveled days and write her trail notes in the dark and manage her dignity through mud crossings and mountain passes and cold Wyoming nights. She had earned this view. She looked over her shoulder and found him there, as she seemed to have developed a reliable sense of where he was, the way that people do when another person has become a consistent feature of their landscape. "Oregon," she said. "Oregon," he agreed. She smiled at him fully, for once without containment, and he held it in him like the warmth of a very good fire. Millhaven was 12 days' travel from the point where they crossed into Oregon Territory, and those 12 days had the particular quality of a thing approaching its completion. Everyone was tired and ready, and the end was real in a way it had not been for most of the journey, and the mood of the wagon train shifted into a kind of tender, pre-arrival clarity. Cecil rode beside Adelaide most of those 12 days, and they talked in the way that people talk when time is running out, and there is still more to be said, a pleasant urgency to it, not anxious but attentive. She told him about her teaching plans in detail, the curriculum she had been developing in her trail notes, the way she intended to structure the school day, the particular texts she had in her trunks that she had chosen with care. He told her about the various skills he had accumulated over 12 years of ranch work, and where those skills might translate usefully in a growing settlement: carpentry, animal husbandry, fencing, general contracting, the kind of broad competence that a new community needs in volume. "You are going to be very employable," she told him one morning with the careful precision of someone offering a reassurance that they have checked for accuracy before delivering. "I hope so," he said. "I intend to build something worth staying in." She looked at him. "In Millhaven." "In Millhaven," he confirmed. She nodded once with the finality that meant she had processed this and filed it correctly. They arrived in Millhaven on the 14th of August, 1872, exactly 4 months after the wagon train had left Dry Creek, Kansas, on the same date in April. Cecil found this symmetry pleasing in a private way. 4 months of following and then arriving. He thought his younger self would not have recognized him. He was not sure his younger self would have liked this version: too much feeling, too much willingness to follow a woman across half a continent without a plan. But he thought his mother would recognize him. He thought Adelaide would recognize him. He thought the man he was now was considerably more accurate to the man he had always been trying to be, and the thought settled in him like coming to rest after a long road. Millhaven was not large, but it was genuine. A collection of timber buildings along a main street, houses spreading outward in an organized pattern that spoke of a community with intentions. There were fields visible at the edges of town, some of them newly planted, some of them productive in the summer abundance of this particular Oregon Valley. There was a proper church and a general store and a livery stable, and the converted barn that was the school, identifiable by the fact that it had a chalkboard mounted on its exterior wall, perhaps as a statement of intent. Adelaide's cousin was named Henry Wells, a broad, weather-reddened man of 35, who had the look of someone who had been working very hard for several years, and was genuinely glad to be proven right about Oregon. He met them at the edge of town with a warmth that was entirely without performance, and he embraced Adelaide with the particular fierceness of a person who had been concerned and is now relieved, and then he looked at Cecil with the frank, measuring look of a man assessing someone important to him. Cecil met the look steadily. Henry Wells nodded, in the way of men communicating approval without ceremony, and said, "The house has 2 spare rooms. I built on last spring." And then he picked up one of Adelaide's trunks and walked toward his house, and that was that. There was a celebration that evening for the arriving wagon train. Millhaven was a community that understood the weight of a successful crossing, and they fed the travelers and gave them space to rest, and were generous in the wholehearted way of people who had themselves arrived by the same difficult road and remembered it. Cecil sat at a long table outside with Adelaide beside him and Henry across, and Holcomb at the far end, and the whole warm noise of a community receiving new members. And he thought about the 14th of April in Dry Creek when he had stood with his cold coffee and watched the wagons go, and had made the only decision that had ever been obviously right even when it made no practical sense. He looked at Adelaide, who was talking with Henry about the school with an animation that she rarely let show to the full the pleasure of a person, discussing the thing they love most with someone who understands its value. She was illuminated, in the way that purpose illuminates people from the inside, and her hands moved when she talked, which they did not usually, and there was nothing contained about her in this moment, just the full, unchecked brightness of it. She must have felt him looking, because she paused in the middle of a sentence about the curriculum and turned to him with the question in her eyes that meant, "Why are you looking at me like that?" He said, quietly, so only she could hear under the noise of the table, "I would leave a job for you again without thinking twice." She looked at him for a moment with the look that was full and clear, and everything she had been holding carefully since the Platte crossing and the Wyoming sunset and all the evenings of fire and talk, and then she said, "I know. I would have found a reason to make you stay anyway." He laughed, a real one, surprised out of him, the kind he did not often hear from himself. She smiled and turned back to Henry and continued her sentence about the curriculum. He picked up his coffee and watched the valley and thought that this was, without qualification, the most fortunate 4 months of his entire life. He stayed, of course. There had never been a question of it, not really, not since Kansas. He found work in Millhaven almost immediately. Henry needed help with the continued construction of the settlement's infrastructure, and there was more than enough building work to occupy a capable man indefinitely. He got himself a room at the boarding house on the main street, which was a proper arrangement, and he picketed Amos at the livery and paid his feed, and he presented himself to Adelaide's school on the morning of its opening as the person who had installed the additional chalkboard inside and repaired the structural issue in the left rear wall and wanted to see how it turned out. The school opened on September the 3rd, 1872, with 14 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, seated on hand-built benches before a proper chalkboard, in a barn that no longer felt like a barn because Adelaide had spent the 2 weeks before the opening making it feel like a school through the specific transformative power of someone who knows exactly what a school should feel like. Cecil stood at the back during the opening. He had no official reason to be there, but Adelaide had told him he could stand at the back, and the other adults who had come to witness the opening did not question it. And he watched Adelaide stand at the front of her schoolroom for the first time and introduce herself to her students with the directness and warmth that was. He had learned the exact combination she deployed when she wanted to make someone feel both respected and welcome. Thomas and Ruth Cartwright were in the front row. Thomas was already raising his hand with a question. Cecil watched Adelaide handle Thomas's question, which was about the stars, naturally, with the patient intelligence that turned any question into a genuine starting point for learning, and he thought about 11 days in Dry Creek and the carpet bag spilling across the street and the reading spectacles in the leather case, and he thought, I would have followed her anywhere. I would follow her anywhere. I will not need to because she is here and so am I, and this is where we are going to be. He had still not sent the letter to his mother. He wrote it that night, a longer version, and he said plainly what he had not been able to say before, that he had found someone of genuine and extraordinary quality, and that he was going to ask her to marry him when the time was right, and he hoped his mother would be glad. His mother's reply, which arrived 6 weeks later in the Millhaven General Store with his name on it in her precise schoolteacher's hand, said, I have been waiting for you to find someone who made you brave. I am glad. Come home when you can and bring her. The time to ask came on a Saturday evening in late October, when Millhaven was settling into its first autumn, and the valley was doing the particular visual thing that Oregon valleys do in autumn. The color moving through the trees on the hillsides in waves of amber and red and a deep, almost theatrical gold. Adelaide had finished the school week and was sitting on Henry's porch with a cup of tea and her notebook, and Cecil had come by with the stated purpose of returning a book Henry had lent him, which was true but was also somewhat beside the point. He sat in the other chair on the porch, and Henry, who was a perceptive man and had understood the situation from approximately the second day, found urgent business inside the house that kept him occupied at length. Cecil had the ring in his coat pocket. He had commissioned it from the jeweler in the next settlement over, 3 weeks ago, and it was simple, a slender gold band with a small garnet, because garnets were the color of the Wyoming sunset, and because he thought Adelaide would prefer something simple and precise over something ornate and imprecise, and he had been right about this, as he had learned to trust that he would be when he applied what he actually knew about her. He did not rehearse a speech. He had considered it and decided that a rehearsed speech was the wrong instrument for this particular conversation, and that the right instrument was the same one that had served him at the Platte Crossing and in Wyoming and every honest moment since, just the unadorned truth offered directly. Adelaide, he said. She looked up from her notebook. I have thought about this for a long time, he said. And what I have thought is this, that you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in 26 years of living, and that I want to be where you are for the rest of my life, and that I would very much like to ask if you will marry me." He produced the ring. She set down her notebook. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. In the trees at the edge of the valley, the autumn wind moved through, and the leaves turned their gold faces up, and the afternoon light was the same deep, warm quality as the Wyoming sunset, and it lasted for a moment that Cecil would be able to recall with absolute precision 20 years later and 30 years later and every year of his life afterward. "Yes," she said, simply and clearly and without ornament, which was exactly how Adelaide Wells had always said the things she was sure of. He put the ring on her finger. She looked at it for a moment with the look she gave to things she found both accurate and satisfying. Then she picked up her notebook and wrote something in it. "Are you taking notes?" he asked. "I write down things I want to remember," she said. He laughed. They were married in December of 1872 in the Millhaven Church, which was small and warm and filled with the wagon train people and the settlement people and Henry Wells, who stood at the front with a brightness in his face that was the particular happiness of a person who has done a good thing by writing a letter and watching what grew from it. The preacher was Elwood Marsh, who had made the journey with them and had settled in Millhaven himself, and he spoke the words with the genuine feeling of a man who had watched the two people before him earn this ceremony across the whole length of a very long road. Briggs played the harmonica. Amos stood in the livery stable and ate his hay, which was all he required of any occasion. Cecil's mother, Margaret Wallace, could not make the journey from Joplin in December. The roads were not kind in winter. But her letter arrived on the morning of the wedding, addressed to both of them, and Adelaide read it aloud at the breakfast table with Henry before they went to the church, and the letter said, among other things, "A man who follows his heart across a prairie in the spring of his best years is a man worth keeping. I cannot be there, but I am there. I will come in the spring and see what he has found, and I expect that I will need to bring a larger trunk than usual to carry home all the admiration I am going to have for the both of you." Adelaide looked up from the letter with a very particular expression, and Cecil thought it was possible she was going to cry, which would have been notable, because in 6 months of knowing her he had not once seen her close to crying, and he thought it was entirely appropriate that his mother had been the one to manage it. "She sounds wonderful," Adelaide said. "She is," he said. "We will go to Joplin in the spring," Adelaide said, with the decisiveness that meant this was now a fixed point in the future. "When school lets out for the summer. She will be very glad of that," Cecil said. Adelaide folded the letter carefully and put it in the inner pocket of her coat, near the one where she kept her reading spectacles. They built their life in Millhaven with the thoroughness that both of them brought to everything. Cecil's construction work expanded into a partnership with 2 other men in the settlement, and by the spring of 1873, they were the principal building outfit in the valley, contracted for houses and barns, and the new proper schoolhouse that the community voted to fund when it became clear that the converted barn was no longer adequate for Adelaide's growing enrollment. The new schoolhouse was built to Adelaide's specifications, which were detailed and precise, and took into account the direction of the morning light and the ventilation in summer, and the position of the chalkboard relative to where students would sit. And Cecil built every inch of it with the same attention he gave to everything she asked of him. He could not tell her enough times, not in words exactly, but in the way he built things and asked her opinion on the building, and incorporated what she said and showed her the result, that her knowledge was something he considered valuable and real. She received this in the way she received things she had verified as true, with a quiet, complete acceptance that was more meaningful than any effusive response would have been. They went to Joplin in June of 1873, when the school let out, making the journey by the stagecoach lines that were increasingly connecting the country that had taken them months to cross on foot and horseback the previous year. Margaret Wallace, who was indeed small and certain about everything, met Adelaide at the door of her house in Joplin with a look of frank, rapid assessment followed by immediate approval. And then she embraced her son with the specific intensity of a woman who has been careful with her worry for a long time and can finally set it down. She showed Adelaide the kitchen first, which Cecil later realized was the most deliberate choice his mother could have made. Her kitchen was the place where she felt most entirely herself, and showing it first was the equivalent of saying, "This is where I actually live, and I am showing you on purpose." Adelaide admired the kitchen with genuine attention, asked about the cast-iron stove, which was a good model, and within 2 hours was sitting across the kitchen table from Margaret with a cup of coffee, talking about education, the state of it, the possibilities of it, what it could accomplish in places that were genuinely building themselves from raw material, with the full bright intensity that Cecil had seen in Millhaven's schoolroom on the first day. His mother looked at him over Adelaide's shoulder during this conversation, and her expression said, with the clarity only a mother could produce, "You did well, Cecil Thomas Wallace. You did very well." He went out to the back porch and sat in the summer evening and felt the completeness of his life around him like a good garment. Their first child was born in January of 1874, a boy they named James, after Cecil's father, which pleased Margaret deeply when the letter arrived. James Wallace arrived on a cold Oregon morning with the matter-of-fact decisiveness that would characterize him all his life, and Cecil held him in the first minutes with a feeling. He had no adequate prior description for the specific weight and warmth and reality of a person who is entirely new to the world, looking out at it with the unfocused but earnest attention of someone getting their bearings. Adelaide looked at him from the bed with the exhaustion of the effort and the brightness underneath it and said, "He looks like he has opinions already." "He gets that from you," Cecil said. "He gets that from both of us," she said, which was true. Adelaide returned to teaching 3 months after James was born, with a practical arrangement that she had planned in advance. Henry's wife, Clara, who had arrived from the East in the spring of 1873, and immediately become Adelaide's most reliable confidant, took James in the mornings while Adelaide taught, and Cecil adjusted his construction schedule to be home by early afternoon, which he managed without difficulty, because he had designed his own work to permit this, because it was what the situation required, and designing situations well was something he had grown very capable of. The school grew. By 1875, Adelaide had 24 students and had trained a young woman named Dorothea Sims to assist with the younger grades. The schoolhouse Cecil had built was already in discussion for an addition. Adelaide was writing a proper teaching manual. The trail notes had expanded and evolved into something more formal, a document that attempted to capture what she had learned about teaching in places that were genuinely in the business of becoming, places where the children needed to understand both the world they had come from and the world they were actively making. She wrote it in the evenings at the kitchen table, by lamplight, with her spectacles on, the same spectacles he had picked up from the Dry Creek Street 3 years ago, now mended twice and indispensable. He sat across the table from her in those evenings, sometimes reading, sometimes working on building plans, sometimes simply being in the same room, which had turned out to be one of the central pleasures of his life. The specific quality of being in the same room with Adelaide when both of them were occupied with their own work. The particular comfort of it. The way the lamplight moved over the table and James slept in the next room, and the Oregon night was quiet and full outside the windows. Their second child, a girl they named Margaret after Cecil's mother, was born in the autumn of 1876 and came into the world with her eyes wide open, which the midwife said was unusual and which Cecil thought was entirely in keeping with the family she had arrived in. She was named for her grandmother, who came out to Oregon the following spring and stayed for 3 months and did not want to leave, and said so clearly, and was perhaps the only person in the world who could reduce Adelaide to tears of genuine laughter through nothing more than the sheer concentrated force of her opinions delivered at the kitchen table. Henry Wells, who had prospered along with Millhaven, built a larger house for his family by 1877, and the original house became a gathering place of the informal kind that good houses become: the neighbors, the school families, the occasional traveler who arrived in Millhaven and found the Wells-Wallace household and stayed for a meal and left knowing they had been in the company of people who had built something worth having. Holcomb passed through Millhaven in 1876 on another journey. He was still running wagon trains, or preparing to, and stayed 2 nights and ate 2 dinners at their table, and told the children about the prairie crossings with a vividness that left both James and infant Margaret transfixed, and said to Cecil, privately, on the evening of his departure, that he had known on the night Cecil rode out of the dark with 8 recovered horses that the man was not traveling on ordinary business, and that he was glad it had gone well. "It went better than I had any right to expect," Cecil said. "Most things worth doing do," Holcomb said, and mounted his horse in the Millhaven morning and rode back east toward Kansas, and Cecil watched him go with the feeling of the wagon trail behind him like a geography of his own life, the particular landscape of a journey that had gone exactly where it needed to go. He went back inside. Adelaide was at the kitchen table with James, who was now 3, and had his mother's exact quality of focused attention, working through a lesson about letters with the seriousness of a person receiving genuinely important information. Adelaide was patient with a patience that was entirely free of condescension. She had never, in Cecil's observation, treated a child's question as less than a real question, and James was working a pencil across a slate with the careful frown of someone at the beginning of a long and productive education. Cecil poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove. Adelaide looked up and found him with her eyes in the way she had developed over 3 years of mornings, the quick, complete look that established that everything was in its right place, that he was here, that the morning was good. "James is going to read before Christmas," she said. "I know he is," Cecil said. "He's got the right teacher." She returned to the slate and James's careful pencil work. Cecil stood at the kitchen window with his coffee and looked out at the Millhaven morning, the main street visible from this angle, the schoolhouse addition that he had finished in the spring, the hills beyond it in their late summer green, the sky above everything doing what Oregon skies did. Varying, interesting, not a sky that repeated itself or settled into predictability. He thought about April the 14th, 1872. He thought about cold coffee and a bruised sky and a woman pressing her hand to the small of her back as she climbed onto a wagon at first light. He thought about the decision that had not felt like a decision, or had felt like the only decision, which was perhaps the definition of the right one. He thought about 2 months' wages in a saddlebag, and a roan horse named Amos who was currently in the paddock behind the house, 20 yards away, still a fine horse, still the best purchase he had ever made on a practical matter. He thought about what Adelaide had said when he told her he had counted the 11 days in Dry Creek. The look on her face at that, not surprised exactly, but the specific soft expression of a person who has been seen accurately and does not know quite what to do with it except to let it be true. He thought, "I left everything for this." And then he thought, "No, I left nothing for everything. There is a considerable difference." James said something to his mother in the earnest, questioning way of a 3-year-old who has produced a letter successfully and wants his achievement confirmed. Adelaide confirmed it with the warmth that she kept, these days, freely available, the warmth that had been there from the beginning but had, in the years of their life together, gradually let itself be seen without the care and guardedness that the world had taught her to put around it. She reached out and touched James's dark hair with the same brief, matter-of-fact gesture with which she had straightened Cecil's collar on the bank of the Platte River 4 years ago, Cecil put his coffee down on the counter and went and pulled up a chair beside them. James looked up at him with his mother's eyes, which he had inherited completely. "I can write a J," James said, with the gravity of an important announcement. "Show me," Cecil said. James applied himself to the slate with the pencil, brow furrowed, and produced a J that was somewhat enthusiastic in its proportions but unmistakably correct. Adelaide looked at Cecil over James's bent head. Her reading spectacles were pushed up on her forehead. The morning light from the kitchen window was in her face, the same quality as that first Wyoming sunset light, and the same quality as a great many mornings since. Each one of them a morning he had woken up to in the conscious, specific gratitude of a man who knows what he has because he can remember the exact moment he made the choice to go after it. She said nothing. She did not need to. After 4 years, they had developed the vocabulary of people who have lived long enough inside the same life to speak with precision in the spaces between words. He put his hand over hers on the table. Outside, the Oregon morning continued its business. The schoolhouse was ready for the autumn term. Millhaven went on becoming what it intended to be. Amos ate his hay in the paddock with the serene contentment of a horse who has been well cared for on a long journey and has arrived somewhere with good grass. James wrote another J, slightly more controlled than the first. Margaret, in the next room, made the small sounds of a child waking to a good morning. And Adelaide Wells, who was Adelaide Wallace now, though she taught under Wells because the families knew her that way, and she had built her reputation under that name, and she was too practical to change it on a matter of pure convention. Adelaide pressed her hand briefly over Cecil's on the kitchen table, the way she did everything, without performance, without excess, with the full and complete and permanent weight of a feeling she had arrived at slowly and kept without any intention of releasing. He had followed a wagon train across the plains and the mountains, and all the enormous, honest, complicated country between the life he had been living and the life he had been looking for, and he had arrived exactly here, at this table, in this morning, in this life that was entirely theirs, built from the ground up in a valley in Oregon that was still becoming itself, in a house that he had built himself to her specifications. With 2 children and a good horse and a mother who wrote letters that made his wife laugh until she cried, and a wagon master who still passed through now. And then with news from the East, and a school that was changing the futures of 24 children a year and growing, he had left nothing behind that was not already ready to be left. He had found everything that had been waiting to be found, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in all the ways that matter to a man sitting at his kitchen table on an Oregon morning in 1877, with his wife's hand under his and his son's earnest pencil work on the slate, and his daughter waking in the next room, and his whole life arranged around him like the best possible version of the country he had crossed to reach it. It was exactly, completely, irreversibly everything.